It's now time for responses, additional responses to the presentation and to the responses. And we will start with Professor Edward Webster, who is the EU ambassador. Am I correct? Oh, okay. Oh, from SWAP. I'm a TV presenter, you see, so I depend a lot on
Look, I'm a sociologist, not an economist, and it reminds me of the comment by Paul Krugman trying to explain reincarnation to a Harvard class, and he said, if you're a good economist, you come back in the next life as a physicist. If you're a bad economist, a wicked economist, you come back in the next life as a sociologist. So I'm not the ambassador, I'm a sociologist. Look, I was brought up in a small town in rural Eastern Cape, in fact the Transkei. And last year I went back to it and did what sociologists do, a survey. I did a household survey. And surveys confirm common sense usually, but they sometimes disturb common sense. And what I found was a community that was almost entirely dependent on social grants. There was no economic activity. Importantly, the old social contract that between the people and the chief had been eroded, but no, in spite of the rhetoric of development in the independent development programs, the community development offices that they had created, there was very little development. In fact, there was a nostalgia, what I would call a Matanzima nostalgia. In the old days, you know, at least we had seeds and we had tractors and so on and so forth. But the important point for me was, instead of development, what we had was a new class, a rather disconnected class, who didn't even live in the town anymore, but went to Queenstown every day, not really engaged with development issues around them. So you have a community caught in a if you like, a dependency trap. And I think the question that I'd like to put, listening to these very interesting presentations, I'm in agreement in broad thrust of what Alex says when he argues that a massive creative of low, poor quality jobs is not the answer. But the question is, you know, what is the solution? And I'd like to put the question to my distinguished colleague, Miriam, from the NDP. The NDP, she says, offers a guiding vision. And I looked quite carefully. I actually did take the trouble of trying to read the NDP, although I must say it's the kind of book, once you put it down, you don't want to pick it up again. But give it a look. What I did is, Miriam. No, what I did, Miriam, out of affection for you, I actually concentrated on chapter 3 on the economy and chapter 11 on social protection. I mean, I think that chapter 11 is a very suggestive and interesting chapter on social protection. I think the question I have really is, how do we bridge, or how do you think one in NDP, how do you bridge this gap between social grants and sustainable employment? How do you make that kind of link? And the question to me is, what policy instruments are you proposing? And most importantly, what social forces are going to drive this vision? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. I suppose now is the time to call on the EU ambassador, Mr. Roeland van Geer.
Thank you very much. Professor Webster.
Yes, I think you have to be a very good ambassador to come back as a professor, but I'll do my best. Thank you very much. No, thank you very much. And I have, of course, with my Swedish colleague, we have listened with great interest to this debate, because in Europe, this is for us not an academic debate. This is very much also a debate that rages, if you like, in Europe. And I'm here only with the Swedish ambassador, so in a way we are not very representative, because we are coming from Northern Europe, where we have a very, very strong belief in social protection, and where we possibly have gone so far that we have to correct. I wouldn't say at all that we are breaking down the welfare state, absolutely not. But it is true that we are looking now for a social protection system which is much more connected in an active way to the labor market than our systems in the past, where there was really social protection and there was the labor market and there were very few links. Let me say very quickly, because I know time is limited, a few things about what we do at the moment with South Africa, a few things about South Africa, and again, coming back to Europe. In the first place, what we as Europe at the moment do with South Africa is very much a reflection of the issues that are discussed here today. Because the government has asked us over the coming years to concentrate on policies relating to employment, on support to education, and on support in the further development of the capacity of the state for service delivery. And this is very much a South African-driven agenda in our EU-South Africa cooperation. It is very much based on the NDP, and we feel it very much reflects the challenges that South Africa is standing for at the moment. And I'm a sailor, I'm a Dutchman, I'm a sailor. So I see the NDP as a compass needle, and a compass needle doesn't give you in detail when you arrive where, but you better follow the compass needle, because if you go from the coals, you end up on the rocks or the beach. And we think that this NDP is, in its diagnostic, a very strong, very open and almost, brutal diagnosis, which we think is absolutely essential in South Africa. And we think as a compass needle that it is extremely, it's pointing in the right direction. So if we take that NDP as the basis for our intervention in employment, education, and assisting the state, I think we are trying jointly to address the questions that are important in South Africa. Now, coming back on the paper, yes, it is important to look at inclusive growth and the narrower path from an economic point of view. But it is also important, and that has been done specifically also by Andrew Donaldson, to look at these risk redistributive mechanisms in a broader sense. And we think in Europe that it is essential to create, if you like, a social and political environment that facilitates growth in the broadest sense possible. Not just economic growth, but also growth in well-being and growth in the capacity of society to deal with challenges. And we think that these risk redistributive mechanisms are essential to promote participation of those who possibly would be marginalized in society as a whole. And that is why we are so disappointed often in political participation and also in the participation in elections. And I think we have there a true crisis in Europe. I'm speeding up. A second point is that the direct effects, of course, are depending on the levels of redistribution. But as I said, yes, there is a macroeconomic effect there, but we see it more in the social and political environment that these redistributive patterns are important. Then, in the case of South Africa, I think you don't have to be an economist to realize that where a large part of your society lives in extremely poor conditions, growth by definition will be slow. And that is why our analysts are extremely concerned about the growth, the decreasing growth at the moment, and we would like to have also a further debate with the government of South Africa. What is causing this growth, this lack of growth? The governor of the bank has said important things there, and I think we have to jointly address these issues. So the causes of the lack of growth, extremely important. They are partly international. Look at Europe. But there are also important elements in this country. And then finally, what is essential is, as I said, that you cut that you connect, I should say, the passive labor market measure with more active labor market measures. In other words, that your social protection is conducive to some form of reintegration in the labor market. But if you don't get a policy mix right in terms of education, infrastructure, your legal framework, financial service and others, then that policy, that labor market policy and that social protection policy, of course, are isolated. And in the case of South Africa, we should avoid that we have a sort of a race where at the one hand the labor market tries to prevent, the labor market protection tries to prevent a collapse, while this policy mix that is required to bring the economy back on track is not proceeding quickly enough. And I think this connection between social protection, which we think is absolutely essential for South Africa, and the broader policy mix is absolutely essential. And I hope that in the coming time, in the discussions between the South African government and the European Union, we can at least share experiences, because, that's my final point, in some European countries we have at the moment levels of youth unemployment that are comparable to South Africa. Spain is a good example, and there we have a whole set of policy measures to fight that. I'm not saying that they're all great, but at least there is a model that addresses these problems. Let me stop here, Chair. There is more to say, but I respect your pressure.
Thanks for that, Ambassador. Let's give him a round of applause. I think it's commendable that the Ambassador is able to concede to some of the challenges that the European Union is facing as well. Our next respondent will be from the UNDP. They deal a lot with discussions of social protection as well, and that's Dr. Babatunda Ombilola.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting us to participate in this very important OR Tambo debate series. We have in the audience the country director for UNDP. For us at UNDP, we identify so much with this particular debate series, and we have been working in this country to support the government of South Africa to actually accelerate the implementation of NDP, the National Development Plan. And we are very clear that the government of South Africa is clear in terms of its vision, what it wants to accomplish for the next, till 2030. The government wants to tackle what it calls the triple challenge in this country, the triple threat: to reduce unemployment, to tackle inequality, and also to reduce poverty. So how can this be done? For us at UNDP, we have one of our 4 programs which is devoted specifically to look at inclusive growth in South Africa. And under this particular inclusive growth program that we have in this country, we're looking specifically at social protection. How can we have good social protection system that will be sustainable, that can help people so that people don't fall into what we call dependency trap? We also have a program which looks at how to expand employment opportunities generally in this country. And we have a specific project on that particular program that looks at what we call the supply development program to actually link small and medium enterprises into larger companies and larger organizations in the country. So having said that, we have also supported the country to look at ways to accelerate land reform in the country as a way of redistributing very valuable assets in this country. and a conference of that nature took place recently. So I've listened, and we have listened very carefully to what most of the debaters have said in terms of what is going on in this country and in terms of how to create synergies between social protection and labor markets in order to generate inclusive growth. So I have 4 quick points to make based on what we have heard here and based on the paper by Professor Alex. The first point to make is that South Africa needs to learn from other experiences, particularly from emerging economies, in terms of how social protection system has been implemented in many other countries. By saying that, it means that there are different kinds of social protection. You can have protective social protection system, you can have productive one, you can also have transformative one. So which kind of social protection system do we want to adopt in this particular country in order to allow people to move out of poverty very quickly? The second point that I want to make very quickly is that growth in itself is not enough to actually reduce poverty and to help an economy such as this. What is important is probably to focus more on human development. By human development, we have to look at 3 dimensions: health, education, and standard of living. And income can be part of that, and that is what we do at UNDP. The third point that I want to make very quickly is that it's also important to look at the continent as a whole, Africa as a whole. Inequality is not a problem that is peculiar to South Africa alone. Rising inequality is peculiar to many countries, not only in Africa, but around the world. And today, 7 of the 10 most unequal countries in the world are currently in Africa. So which means South Africa may have up to around Gini coefficient of 0.69, according to Stats South Africa. But the issue is South Africa started from an initial low base. So it's extremely difficult for the country to get out of that mode. But in order to get out of it, what should be done will be to look at policies that can help, not only in terms of redistribution, but that can also help in terms of looking at skill development. Somebody talked about education earlier on. It's very important to invest so much in education, particularly for this country. Then I think also the fourth point that I want to make very quickly is that the best form of social protection should be through employment opportunities, and that is what we believe in. And having said that, we need to come back to the real definition of inclusive growth. How do you define inclusive growth? When you have labor market combined with social protection, you cannot necessarily have inclusive growth through that. So in terms of defining it, and I think that is what we should look at in the case of South Africa, 3 dimensions come out clearly for us. The first dimension is that such growth must be sustained for a long period of time. In the case of South Africa, we know that the growth rate in 2012 stood at 2.5%. Last year, 2013, the growth rate stood at 1.9%. And probably at the end of this year, the growth rate will stand below 2% again. So the first dimension, as I said, the growth must be sustained for a long period of time. The second dimension is that such growth must cut across broad-based economic sectors. And by saying that, it means that we have to look at sources of growth. And in the case of South Africa, we need to define what the sources of growth are. The third dimension, very quickly, is that such growth, inclusive growth, must be able to employ majority of a country's population. I think for many of us, it is unacceptable that for the last 3 years or 2 years, unemployment rate in the country has been around 25%. So those are some of the key issues. In terms of a quick solution that some of us need to look at is that the development of the NDP was inclusive, and the implementation of NDP should as well be very inclusive. So we are very happy for this particular debate that is ongoing, and UNDP will continue to identify with this debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.